An entire empire can disappear before the morning coffee gets cold. This video uncovers the true stories of history's most sudden collapses, from gleaming Bronze Age palaces to modern superpowers that vanished almost overnight. You will gain a powerful new understanding of how civilizations fall and what it means for our own world today. How did a volcanic eruption erase an entire seafaring culture in a single generation? What hidden weakness allowed conquerors to topple a mountain empire in just 2 years? By the end, you will see the fragile threads that hold every society together. What do you believe is the greatest threat to our own civilization's survival? History often moves slowly, but sometimes it breaks into a sprint. The idea of an empire vanishing overnight is not about a literal 24-hour countdown. It is about a collapse so swift and so complete it feels instantaneous to those living through it. One day, a civilization stands at the height of its power. Then, in a breathtakingly short span of years, its central authority shatters, its cities are abandoned, its culture fades. To the outside world and to future historians, it seems to have disappeared almost without warning. This is the essence of the overnight collapse, a phenomenon starkly different from a long, slow decline. A gradual fall might play out over centuries, giving people time to adapt. A sudden collapse is a historical shockwave. It leaves a power vacuum so immense that the entire geopolitical landscape is redrawn before anyone can truly comprehend what has happened. To understand how this happens, we must look at the convergence of pressures. Political instability weakens the government's grip. Economic strain empties the treasury and fuels public discontent. Environmental stress, from drought to famine, pushes society to its breaking point. When these forces align, they can accelerate a downfall with terrifying speed. Consider a modern example: the fall of the Soviet Union. For decades, it stood as one of two global superpowers, a colossal empire with a vast military and immense influence. Yet, its disintegration was remarkably fast. In just a few short years, from the late 1980s to the early 90s, the entire political structure unraveled. The red flag was lowered for the last time. Republics declared their independence. For millions of citizens and for observers around the globe, the change was stunningly abrupt. It felt, for all intents and purposes, like an overnight event. This modern case gives us a framework, a set of criteria to identify similar ruptures in the deeper past. We look for a rapid loss of centralized control, a disappearance of cultural and economic complexity, and a contemporary sense of shock and disbelief. With this definition clear, we can now journey back more than 3,000 years to one of history's most profound and puzzling disappearances: the catastrophic collapse of the entire Bronze Age world. The world of the late Bronze Age was a surprisingly globalized one. For centuries, a complex network of empires, including the Hittites in Anatolia, the Mycenaeans in Greece, and the New Kingdom Egyptians, thrived on international trade. They exchanged everything from tin and copper for bronze to luxury goods and diplomatic letters. This was a stable, interconnected system of powerful kingdoms. Then, around 1200 BC, it all came crashing down in what seems like a historical blink of an eye. Within a few decades, nearly every major palace and city from Greece to the Levant was burned, abandoned, or left in ruins. The collapse was so comprehensive that even the art of writing was lost in many regions, plunging the eastern Mediterranean into a dark age that would last for centuries. So what could possibly cause such a widespread and simultaneous failure? Archaeologists like Eric Klein describe it as a perfect storm, a cascade of crises where no single disaster was solely responsible, but together they created an unstoppable chain reaction. A prolonged drought, possibly linked to a shifting climate, led to crop failure and famine. This internal economic strain was then amplified by the breakdown of those vital international trade routes. As resources became scarce, internal rebellions and societal unrest likely weakened kingdoms from within, and then from the sea came a mysterious and terrifying force. Ancient Egyptian records speak of relentless attacks by confederations known only as the Sea Peoples. We still do not know exactly who they were or where they came from, but their impact was devastating. They appear in the historical record as both marauders and migrants, a wave of movement that overwhelmed already fragile states. The city of Ugarit, a wealthy and vital port in modern-day Syria, encapsulates this tragedy. A desperate letter found in its ruins sent to the King of Cyprus pleads for help. It states that the enemy's ships have already come and burned my cities with fire. The letter was never sent. Ugarit was destroyed and never reoccupied. This case shows that even the most sophisticated and interconnected empires are not immune to a convergence of pressures. When environmental catastrophe, economic collapse, and external invasion hit at once, the foundations of civilization can crumble with breathtaking speed. This pattern of a cascading failure, rather than a single knockout blow, becomes a recurring theme in history's most sudden collapses. It sets the stage for understanding another empire whose end was so swift it became legendary, the Akkadian Empire. Centuries before the Bronze Age palaces fell, another empire demonstrated just how quickly a vast realm could disintegrate. The Akkadian Empire, forged by Sargon of Akkad, was history's first true empire, uniting the city-states of Mesopotamia under a single rule for over a century. Its power seemed absolute, its reach immense, yet this pioneering superpower shattered in what appears to be a geological instant. The cause of its demise was not a foreign army with superior weapons, but something far more elemental, a profound and lasting shift in the very climate. Geological cores drilled from the ancient site of Tel Leilan in Syria tell a stark story. They reveal a layer of wind-blown dust that suddenly appears, evidence of a catastrophic drought that gripped the region for nearly 300 years. This was not merely a few dry seasons, it was a climatic event so severe it fundamentally rewrote the rules of survival. The Akkadian Empire was an edifice built on grain. Its central authority, its standing armies, its entire administrative structure, all depended on a reliable agricultural surplus from the fertile north. When the rains failed and the dust storms began, that foundation simply vanished. Historian Mario Liverani paints a picture of a society pushed to the brink. Famine would have sparked desperate internal migrations as starving farmers abandoned their fields and poured into the cities. This sudden pressure on dwindling food supplies inevitably led to social unrest and rebellion, breaking the bonds of loyalty that held the empire together. At the same time, nomadic groups from the margins, themselves feeling the pinch of the arid conditions, saw the weakened empire as an opportunity, launching incursions that the crippled central authority could no longer repel. The collapse was not a slow fading, it was a cascading failure. The climate shock triggered an economic collapse which in turn fueled political fragmentation. The empire's vast territory, once its greatest strength, became impossible to manage and supply. Regional governors likely seized control over their own local grain stores, accelerating the breakdown of centralized power. In a historical perspective, the end came almost overnight. The imperial system vanished, leaving behind a fractured landscape of isolated, struggling city-states. The story of Akkad is a powerful lesson in foundational vulnerability. It shows that an empire's greatest threat may not be the army at its gates, but the slow, invisible change in the weather patterns that sustain its people. This theme of a sophisticated civilization brought down by nature's whims finds a haunting parallel in the fate of another great sea power, the Minone civilization of Crete. The island of Crete was the heart of a maritime empire, a civilization so vibrant its memory would one day fuel the legend of Atlantis. The Minones were not just powerful, they were sophisticated. Their palaces were sprawling, multi-story complexes with intricate plumbing and stunning frescoes depicting dolphins and bull-leaping ceremonies. This was a society confident in its art, its trade, and its mastery of the sea. Then, around 1450 BC, the lights went out. The great palace at Knossos and other centers were violently destroyed or abandoned, their advanced culture vanishing from the historical record with shocking speed. What force could extinguish such a brilliant flame so abruptly? The answer may lie 70 miles to the north on the island of Thera. This was not merely a volcanic eruption. It was one of the most colossal geological events in human history. Volcanologists estimate the Thera eruption was 4 or 5 times more powerful than the notorious Krakatoa explosion of 1883. It would have been a cataclysm almost beyond comprehension. First came the earthquakes shaking Crete to its foundations. Then the volcano itself exploded, blasting cubic miles of rock and ash into the sky. But the true devastation for a seafaring people came from the sea. The collapse of the volcanic cone into the emptied magma chamber triggered a tsunami of unimaginable scale. A wall of water, perhaps hundreds of feet high, would have raced across the open ocean before crashing onto the northern coast of Crete. It would have obliterated the Minone fleet, their very source of power and wealth, and scoured coastal settlements and ports from the map. The fallout did not stop there. A thick blanket of volcanic ash settled over the eastern Mediterranean. On Crete, this ashfall would have poisoned farmlands for a generation, rendering the soil infertile and causing widespread famine. In a single, terrible sequence, the Minones lost their navy, their coastal infrastructure, and their food supply. Their economy, built on trade and agriculture, collapsed. A society shattered by nature is often a society unable to defend itself. In the power vacuum that followed the disaster, a new force emerged from the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans. Archaeological evidence from Knossos shows a clear change. The linear A script of the Minones disappears, replaced by the Mycenaean linear B. The styles of art and pottery shift dramatically. It appears the Mycenaeans did not just trade with the weakened Minones, they moved in and took over. The Minone collapse was therefore not one single cause, but a devastating 1-2 punch. The volcanic eruption was the critical, destabilizing blow that crippled their civilization. The Mycenaean incursion was the finishing move, a political and cultural takeover that erased the Minone identity from leadership. This fusion of natural disaster and human opportunism created a collapse so complete it feels instantaneous in the archaeological record. The Minones, like the Acadians, show us that environmental catastrophe can be the great equalizer, capable of reducing the most advanced empire to a memory, a ghost that haunts the ruins of its own palaces and inspires myths for millennia to come. This pattern of internal weakness meeting external force would be repeated on a scale so vast it defined the end of an era, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Rome's fall was not a slow sunset but a sudden blackout. For centuries, the empire seemed unshakable, its legions policing a vast territory from Britain to the Middle East. Yet the Western Empire's final act was breathtakingly swift. Within a single lifetime, its political structure vanished. The pivotal moment came in 476, when a Germanic general named Odoacer simply deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus. There was no grand battle, no final siege. The Western Roman Empire as a political entity was just over. How did a superpower that had weathered crises for centuries dissolve so completely in just a few decades? The answer lies in a fatal convergence of pressures that accelerated its demise. Historian Edward Gibbon famously pointed to internal decay, arguing that the sheer size of the empire and the immense cost of its military made it ungovernable. This overexpansion stretched its resources to a breaking point. The army, once a disciplined force of citizen soldiers, became a bloated, expensive machine reliant on foreign mercenaries who often held greater loyalty to their own commanders than to a distant emperor in Ravenna. At the same time, the economy was caught in a vicious spiral. To pay for the military, emperors debased the currency, cutting the silver content in coins until they were nearly worthless. This triggered hyperinflation, making it impossible for the state to pay its soldiers or for ordinary people to afford basic goods. Trade routes that had once fed the cities with grain and luxuries broke down as law and order faded on the roads and seas. Then came the external shocks, waves of barbarian groups, pushed by the migrations of the Huns from the east, began crossing the imperial frontiers not just as raiders, but as entire peoples seeking new homes. The sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 sent a psychological shockwave across the ancient world. For the first time in 800 years, the Eternal City had been breached. The even more destructive sack by the Vandals in 455 stripped the city of its remaining wealth and pride. These were not isolated attacks but symptoms of a complete failure of border defense. A series of weak and short-lived emperors, often installed and murdered by their own troops, created a leadership vacuum. There was no central authority left to coordinate a response or rally the provinces. Outbreaks of plague further decimated the population, shrinking the tax base and the pool of army recruits. The collapse was a cascade. Political corruption and economic inflation crippled the state from within, making it utterly vulnerable to the barbarian invasions from without. The empire did not slowly crumble. It shattered under the compounded weight of its own internal weaknesses and relentless external pressure. This pattern of a complex society unraveling with stunning speed leads us to another enigma: the mysterious abandonment of the Maya classic cities. Deep in the jungles of Central America, the stone cities fell silent. Between the 8th and 9th centuries, the Maya civilization of the classic period experienced a collapse so rapid it seems to defy logic. This was not a single empire, but a network of powerful, independent city-states like Tikal and Palenque, each with its own king and towering temples. They were masters of astronomy, mathematics, and architecture, creating a society of immense sophistication. Yet, within a span of just a few generations, these urban centers were almost entirely abandoned. The sculpting of grand stone stelae, which recorded the deeds of kings and the passage of time, simply stopped. The jungle did not slowly creep back, it surged in, swallowing plazas and palaces in a green tide, leaving a mystery that would endure for 1,000 years. How could such an advanced culture vanish from its own heartland almost overnight? The answer, emerging from decades of archaeological detective work, points not to one villain but to a perfect storm of crises. At the heart of the collapse was a profound environmental catastrophe. Scientists drilling into lake beds on the Yucatan Peninsula have uncovered a chilling story written in mud and sediment. The evidence reveals a series of severe, multi-decade droughts that gripped the region right at the time of the collapse. For a civilization utterly dependent on seasonal rains to fill their reservoirs and grow their maize, this was a death sentence. The water stores dried up, crops failed repeatedly, and famine would have spread through the densely populated cities. This environmental stress acted like a magnifying glass, intensifying every existing weakness. As resources grew scarce, the competition between city-states, once channeled into ritual ball games and royal rivalries, erupted into total warfare. Archaeologist Arthur Demarest, after extensive excavations, describes this as a system failure. The very structure of Maya society, centered on divine kings who were believed to ensure the rains and fertility, began to crack under the pressure. When the kings failed to bring water, their divine authority evaporated. The intricate web of alliances and trade that connected the cities frayed and then snapped. The elite class, which depended on a vast population of farmers to sustain it, found itself ruling over starving and desperate people who had lost all faith. The result was a cascading collapse. Warfare drained resources and destroyed infrastructure. Famine led to social unrest and a plummeting population, either from death or from dispersal as people fled the cities to survive in the countryside. The political and economic system could not withstand the combined shock of drought, war, and rebellion. It was a catastrophic convergence that left the great stone cities as empty monuments to a forgotten glory, a stark reminder that pyramids are no match for a sky that refuses to rain. This pattern of a sophisticated society succumbing to environmental pressure finds a haunting echo across the world in the fate of another jungle empire, the great Khmer Empire of Inca. The silence that fell over the Maya cities finds a chilling parallel on the other side of the world, in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The Khmer Empire, with its magnificent capital at Inca, represented the pinnacle of urban and hydraulic engineering. At its zenith in the 12th century, it was the largest pre-industrial city on Earth, a sprawling metropolis sustained by a breathtakingly complex water management system. Canals, reservoirs, and massive barrages or water tanks channeled the life-giving monsoon rains to feed a vast population of rice farmers. This infrastructure was the empire's greatest achievement, the very engine of its power. Yet this same network of canals would become the instrument of its rapid undoing. By the 15th century, Angkor was abandoned, its grand temples like Angkor Wat left to the encroaching forest. The collapse was stunningly swift. How could a civilization that so masterfully tamed water simply walk away from its greatest creation? The answer lies in a convergence of environmental and human pressures that turned its strength into a fatal weakness. Recent LiDAR surveys, which use lasers to map the ground beneath the jungle canopy, have revealed the shocking scale of the problem. The same canals that once irrigated the empire's fields began to choke on their own success. Deforestation in the surrounding hills led to massive erosion, causing the intricate waterways to silt up. This siltation, combined with evidence from tree rings pointing to prolonged and severe monsoon failures, created a perfect storm. The system designed to buffer against drought instead amplified the crisis. When the rains failed, the clogged canals could not hold or distribute the scarce water that did arrive. The agricultural base that fed the million-plus inhabitants of Angkor crumbled, leading to widespread famine. As historian Michael D. Coe has argued, this environmental catastrophe was compounded by significant shifts in the empire's spiritual and political life. The state religion transitioned from Hinduism, which upheld the god-king status of the ruler, to the Theravada Buddhism, a more individualistic and egalitarian faith. This theological shift subtly undermined the divine authority of the kings, making it harder for the central power to command the massive labor force needed to maintain the crumbling water infrastructure. At the very moment the system demanded a Herculean effort to clear the silted canals, the will and the means to do so had evaporated. Then came the external pressure. Neighboring Siamese kingdoms, growing in power and ambition, began launching relentless attacks on the weakened empire. the Khmer leadership made a fateful decision. Rather than pour dwindling resources into saving a failing hydraulic system, they abandoned Inca around 1431 and moved the capital to regions closer to the Mekong River. The depopulation was rapid and decisive. The people followed their rulers to new lands, leaving the stone gods of Inca to face the jungle alone. The Khmer collapse is a profound lesson in infrastructural dependency. The very system that enabled the empire's rise became a millstone around its neck when the climate turned against it. It demonstrates that a society's greatest strength can, in a crisis, become its most critical vulnerability. This theme of a complex, highly organized state being shattered by an unexpected external force reaches its most dramatic expression with the Inca Empire. The sheer speed of the Inca Empire's fall is almost incomprehensible. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro landed on the coast of Peru with fewer than 200 men. Just 2 years later, the empire that stretched for thousands of miles along the Andes, a realm of millions, was effectively conquered. This was not a gradual erosion but a sudden, spectacular shattering. The secret to this rapid collapse lies not in Spanish superiority alone, but in a perfect and tragic alignment of vulnerabilities that the invaders expertly exploited. The empire was already fractured from within. A brutal civil war had just concluded, pitting two brothers, Atahualpa and Huascar, against each other in a fight for the throne. Atahualpa had emerged victorious, but his hold on power was fresh and fragile, with the empire's political loyalties deeply divided and its military exhausted. Into this weakened state stepped Pizarro, the chronicler Garcilaso de la Vega, himself of mixed Inca and Spanish heritage, recorded the fateful encounter at Cajamarca. He describes Atahualpa entering the main square surrounded by thousands of unarmed retainers, confident in his own divine authority. Pizarro's chaplain approached the emperor, demanding he submit to a foreign god and king. When Atahualpa disdainfully rejected the Bible thrown at his feet, the Spanish launched their trap. The roar of cannons and firearms, weapons the Incas had never seen, caused instant pandemonium. Cavalry, which the Inca perceived as a single, monstrous creature of man and beast, charged into the crowd. The psychological shock was absolute. The Spanish captured Atahualpa himself, decapitating the empire's leadership in a single, stunning stroke. But the Spanish did not conquer a healthy empire, they toppled one that was already critically ill. European diseases, particularly smallpox, had raced ahead of the conquistadors, traveling along trade routes from earlier contacts. This invisible army was devastating. Waves of epidemics swept through the Andes, killing a vast portion of the population, including the previous emperor and his designated heir, which is what had triggered the civil war in the first place. The society was in a state of demographic and spiritual collapse before a single Spanish soldier marched inland. The combination was unstoppable. The Spanish, with their steel weapons, guns, and horses, represented a technological shock that shattered Inca military tactics. More importantly, they understood the empire's political structure. By capturing the Sopa Inca, the living god king, they paralyzed the entire system of command. Without Atahualpa, the intricate network of provincial governors and generals had no clear center, no ultimate authority to rally around. The Spanish simply inserted themselves at the top of the existing hierarchy, using the empire's own administrative machinery to control it, even as they dismantled its culture and beliefs. The fall of the Inca Empire stands as history's ultimate lesson in the power of an external shock. It shows that a civilization can possess immense wealth, sophisticated roads, and a powerful army, yet still be brought to its knees almost overnight by a convergence of internal strife, invisible pathogens, and a ruthless foreign actor who knows exactly where to strike. This pattern of a settled society succumbing to an unexpected outside force finds a quieter, but no less mysterious, echo in the frozen silence of the Arctic, where another Viking colony simply vanished. Even the hardiest settlers can vanish without a trace. On the rugged coast of Greenland, the Norse built a society that lasted nearly 500 years. They established two main settlements, the eastern and western, with farms, churches, and a lifestyle transplanted from their Scandinavian homeland. They raised cattle and sheep, wore woolen clothing, and traded walrus ivory and narwhal tusks with Norway for the essential iron and timber they could not produce locally. For centuries, they were a distant but functioning outpost of medieval Europe. Then they were gone. By the middle of the 15th century, the settlements were silent, the farms empty. The last written record of them is a marriage recorded in a church in 1408. After that, nothing. What happened to these tenacious Vikings? The evidence points to a slow squeeze, a series of pressures that finally culminated in a swift and final collapse. Archaeologist Thomas McGovern's work reveals a society that clung stubbornly to its European identity, even as the world around it grew colder and more hostile. The onset of the Little Ice Age brought longer, more severe winters and shorter growing seasons. The Norse, deeply committed to their pastoral way of life, watched their pastures shrink under the relentless cold. Their cattle, a powerful symbol of status and wealth, required more hay than they could now produce, and the animals grew stunted and weak. This environmental shift was a direct assault on their core economy. At the same time, their vital lifeline to Europe frayed and then snapped. The Black Death ravaged Norway in the mid-14th century, decimating the population and disrupting the trade networks that the Greenlanders depended on for survival. A ship from Europe became a rare sight. Without regular contact, they lost access to the iron tools, new wood, and cultural reinforcement that kept them connected to a wider world. They were utterly alone. This isolation was compounded by their relationship with the neighboring Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit. While the Norse struggled on their failing farms, the Inuit thrived. They were supremely adapted to the Arctic environment, hunting seals and whales from sleek kayaks and using every part of the animal for food, clothing, and tools. The archaeological record shows remarkably little evidence of trade or cultural exchange between the two groups. The Norse, it seems, viewed the Inuit as pagan outsiders and refused to adopt their successful survival technologies. This cultural inflexibility proved fatal. They continued to build their churches in the European style while their own children may have gone hungry. The end, when it came, was quiet but absolute. Excavations of Norse farmsteads show a haunting scene. Homes were left intact with everyday objects still in place. It was not destruction by war or fire that ended this community, but a gradual starvation and a final, desperate decision to leave. The last few hundred survivors, facing a choice between a slow death and a perilous escape, likely packed into small boats and attempted a journey back to Iceland, a voyage for which their weakened, isolated society was ill-prepared. They vanished into the sea and the silence of history. The Greenland Norse did not fall to a mighty army, but to a cascade of smaller failures. Their story is a profound lesson in the danger of inflexibility. They failed to adapt their economy to a changing climate. They failed to diversify their food sources, and most critically, they failed to learn from their neighbors. When their support networks vanished, their society, built on a fragile model of European agriculture at the edge of the world, had no resilience left. This pattern of a sophisticated center collapsing under the weight of its own rigid structures finds a dramatic parallel in the heart of the Islamic world, with the sudden unraveling of the Abbasid Caliphate. Baghdad was the intellectual capital of the world. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, the city's House of Wisdom was a global center for science, philosophy, and medicine, a beacon of progress during a golden age that stretched from Spain to India. Yet this pinnacle of civilization proved to be shockingly fragile. The empire did not fade away, it shattered from within, its disintegration accelerated by a single, catastrophic event that serves as a brutal case study in sudden collapse. The heart of this failure was a political paradox. To protect their vast empire, the Abbasids created a powerful army of military slaves known as Mamluks. These soldiers, purchased as boys and trained exclusively for war, were meant to be the ultimate loyal guard, free from tribal or family ties, but this strength became a fatal flaw. Over time, the Mamluks grew to realize their own power. They were the ones holding the swords, and they began to dictate terms, eventually becoming the true kingmakers in Baghdad, reducing the caliph to a mere figurehead. This internal power vacuum was exploited by regional governors. Seeing the central authority weaken, these local rulers in provinces from Egypt to Persia began hoarding tax revenues and declaring their own independence. The empire was hollowing out, its territories breaking away piece by piece while the caliph remained a prisoner in his own palace. Then came the final external blow. In 1258, a Mongol army led by Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, arrived at the gates of Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim fatally misjudged the threat, believing the city's spiritual significance would protect it. He was tragically wrong. The siege was short and merciless. The Mongol armies diverted the Tigris River, breaching the city's defenses. What followed was a week of destruction so complete it stunned the medieval world. Libraries, including the legendary House of Wisdom, were burned, their priceless manuscripts thrown into the river. Contemporary accounts describe the Tigris running black with ink from the books and red with the blood of the slain. The caliph himself was executed, rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, a Mongol custom that avoided the spilling of a royal bloodline on the earth. The political entity of the Abbasid Caliphate was effectively erased overnight. The great historian Ibn Khaldun would later analyze this pattern, describing the inevitable cycle where strong dynasties grow soft in their cities, becoming vulnerable to the hard, disciplined forces from the frontiers. The Abbasid collapse was the ultimate expression of this theory. It was not a slow decline but a swift unraveling, where internal political decay met an overwhelming external force. The empire's legacy, however, did not vanish. Its knowledge and culture diffused, carried by refugees and scholars to new centers in India, Europe, and beyond, seeding the Renaissance. This dramatic fall, born from a fatal mix of internal power struggles and foreign conquest, finds a startling parallel across the Atlantic, where another mighty empire would be brought to its knees with even more breathtaking speed. The Aztec Empire's fall reads like a thriller, a cascade of events so perfectly aligned it feels almost scripted. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico with a small force of Spanish soldiers. Just 2 years later, the mighty empire centered on the island city of Tenochtitlan was rubble, its last emperor dead and its dominion shattered. The speed of this collapse was not due to Spanish invincibility, but to a brilliant and ruthless exploitation of the empire's deepest political fractures. Cortés was not just a conqueror, he was a master strategist who understood that the Aztec Empire was a patchwork of subjugated peoples who deeply resented their overlords in Tenochtitlan. He skillfully turned this resentment into a weapon, forging a crucial alliance with the Tlaxcalans, a powerful confederation that had long resisted Aztec rule. This was the empire's greatest vulnerability, and Cortés plunged a wedge directly into it. He did not arrive with an army large enough to conquer an empire. he arrived with a catalyst that would help the empire conquer itself. The chronicler Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who marched with Cortés, left a vivid account of their first entry into Tenochtitlan. They crossed the great causeways and beheld a city more populous and magnificent than any in Spain, with towering temples and bustling canals. The Emperor Moctezuma received them with immense ceremony, but his actions were marked by a profound and fatal hesitation. Was Cortés the returning god Quetzalcoatl, as some prophecies suggested? This cultural uncertainty paralyzed Moctezuma, allowing the Spanish to take him hostage within his own palace. The capture of the emperor was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. By seizing the semi-divine figure at the heart of the political and religious universe, Cortés effectively severed the head of the empire. The Aztec state, so centralized around the person of the emperor, was thrown into instant disarray. But the true decimating force was one the Spanish carried unknowingly. Smallpox arrived with the Europeans, and it raced through the native population, which had no immunity. This was a biological catastrophe. The disease killed warriors, farmers, and nobles alike, including Moctezuma's successor, Cuitlahuac, just as he was organizing a fierce resistance. The city was weakened, its social order crumbling under the weight of mass death. When the Spanish and their thousands of indigenous allies finally laid siege to Tenochtitlan in 1521, the outcome was almost inevitable. Diaz del Castillo described the ferocious street-by-street fighting, where Spanish steel swords and cannons proved devastating against Aztec obsidian-tipped clubs and cotton armor. The technological disparity was real, but it was the combination of European weapons, native allied forces, and a population shattered by disease that made the siege so brutally effective. The Aztec collapse demonstrates a terrifying formula where diplomatic cunning, invisible pathogens, and targeted force can converge to bring down a powerful state in what amounts to a historical instant. It underscores that the greatest threat to an empire is often not a foreign army, but the internal divisions a clever adversary can exploit. A similar story of internal pressure and sudden fracture would play out on a global scale centuries later with the stunningly peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union. For decades, it stood as one of the world's two superpowers, a colossal state with a vast nuclear arsenal and a seemingly unshakable ideology. Yet its disintegration was remarkably swift and largely bloodless. In just a few short years, from the late 1980s to 1991, the entire political structure simply came apart. How could such a powerful empire vanish almost overnight without a major war? The answer lies not in an external invasion, but in a perfect storm of internal economic failure, political reforms that spiraled out of control, and a profound loss of faith from its own people. That same formula of internal decay and sudden fracture played out with breathtaking speed in our own modern era. The Soviet Union was not just another empire, it was a nuclear-armed superpower whose ideological struggle with the West defined global politics for nearly half a century. Its power seemed monolithic, permanent, yet in the final years of the 1980s it simply unraveled. The trigger was not a world war, but a failed coup in August of 1991. Hardline communists, desperate to reverse the reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev, placed him under house arrest. For 3 tense days, the world held its breath, waiting to see if the Soviet Empire would reassert itself with an iron fist. But the old guard had misjudged the moment entirely. Their coup collapsed in the face of public defiance, most famously from Boris Yeltsin, who stood atop a tank in Moscow and denounced the plotters. This was the point of no return. The attempted takeover, meant to preserve the Union, instead shattered its last vestiges of authority. Republic after republic, from the Baltic states to Ukraine, looked at the crumbling center and declared their independence. By December of that year, the Soviet Union was formally dissolved. How did a superpower reach this breaking point so quickly? The roots of the collapse lay in a deep and systemic economic stagnation. For decades, the state-controlled economy had been falling further and further behind the capitalist West. Store shelves were often empty, and the technological revolution was passing it by. This was not a sudden crisis, but a long, slow rot that had eaten away at the foundations of the Soviet promise. Into this stagnant system stepped Gorbachev with his twin policies of glasnost and perestroika, meaning openness and restructuring. He believed the system could be reformed, but he inadvertently opened a floodgate. Glasnost allowed people to openly criticize the government for the first time, exposing the full extent of the system's failures and crimes. Perestroika's economic reforms were too little, too late, only worsening shortages and creating chaos. This new openness did not save the economy, but it did fuel long-suppressed nationalist movements. The Baltic states, forcibly annexed by Stalin, saw their chance and began agitating for freedom. The entire Eastern Bloc, which had been held in place by the threat of Soviet tanks, began to shake loose. Nothing symbolized this more powerfully than the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. That concrete and barbed wire division was the ultimate symbol of a divided world. When it was breached by joyous crowds, it was not just a wall that fell, but an entire sphere of influence. The Soviet Empire was receding in real time. The collapse was stunningly peaceful because the ideology that bound it together had simply evaporated. The people, and even many of the leaders, had stopped believing in the system. When the final test came with the coup, there was no will left to fight for it. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, not in battle, but in quiet acknowledgement that the empire was already gone. This modern example proves that even the most heavily armed states are not immune to the invisible pressures of economic failure and lost faith. It shows that an empire can vanish not with a bang, but with a sigh, its ideological heart giving out long before its borders officially change. This pattern of a complex urban society simply fading away finds one of its deepest mysteries in the ancient world, with the enigmatic end of the Indus Valley civilization. The silence of the Indus Valley is one of history's most profound mysteries. While other empires fell in fire and conquest, this civilization, encompassing over 1 million square kilometers, simply faded away. Its cities, like the meticulously planned Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, were marvels of the ancient world, featuring the world's first sophisticated urban sanitation systems with indoor toilets and covered drains. Yet by 1900 BC, these bustling centers were being systematically abandoned, not destroyed. The archaeological record shows no layers of ash, no heaps of skeletons from a great battle, no evidence of a violent end. Instead, the streets were simply left to the dust. So what could cause a society of such scale and sophistication to voluntarily walk away from its greatest achievements? The leading theory points to a slow-moving environmental catastrophe. The lifeblood of this civilization was not a single river, but a network of them, centered on the Gaga-Hakra river system, which many scholars believe was once a mighty waterway, perhaps even the legendary Saraswati River mentioned in ancient texts. Geological and climate data suggest that around the time of the collapse, the monsoons that fed these rivers began to shift southward. The rivers shrunk, becoming seasonal streams, and then dried up entirely. For a society dependent on agriculture to feed its dense urban populations, this was a death sentence. Archaeologist Jane McIntosh suggests this was not a sudden event, but a prolonged stress that triggered a gradual migration. Imagine generations of farmers watching their fields turn to dust, their water stores dwindling year after year. the response was not a single, dramatic exodus, but a slow, relentless dispersal. People did not vanish, they simply moved. They likely broke into smaller groups and migrated eastward toward the more reliable waters of the Ganges River basin, shifting from an urban, centralized way of life to a more rural, village-based existence. This environmental pressure was almost certainly amplified by economic collapse. The Indus Valley people were master traders, with their distinctive seals found in Mesopotamia. As the river networks that served as their trade routes dried up, this long-distance commerce would have evaporated. The loss of this economic engine would have crippled the urban elites and the artisans who depended on it. The complex, standardized systems of weights and measures that defined their culture became irrelevant. Without trade, without a tax base, and without the agricultural surplus to sustain them, the very idea of the city lost its meaning. The collapse was a cultural fade, not a dramatic break. The beautiful, undeciphered script stopped being used. The intricate bead-making techniques were forgotten. The grand urban planning, with its straight streets and universal brick sizes, gave way to simpler local styles. This was a quiet, decentralized unraveling. The people survived, but their civilization did not. It melted back into the landscape, leaving behind ghost cities and a timeless puzzle. The story of the Indus Valley reminds us that an empire does not always need to be toppled by an enemy. It can simply be abandoned when the environment that nurtured it can no longer provide. A silent lesson in the absolute necessity of ecological adaptability for any society that hopes to endure. This pattern of a rapid, though less mysterious, collapse is also visible in the short, turbulent history of the Yuan dynasty. Even the heirs of the mighty Mongol Empire could not defy the rhythm of a rapid collapse. The Yuan dynasty, founded by the great Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, saw its vast dominion over China disintegrate in less than 100 years. This was not the slow fading of a tired regime, but a swift and decisive overthrow. By 1368, the Mongol rulers were driven back to the steppes, their grand imperial project in China finished. How did a dynasty born from such unparalleled military conquest unravel so completely? The answer lies in a fatal combination of natural disasters and a profound failure of cultural connection. The Yuan court in Beijing remained aloof, a separate class of Mongol elites who never fully integrated with the Han Chinese majority they ruled. They preserved their own language, customs, and hierarchies, creating a permanent divide between the rulers and the ruled. This cultural alienation bred deep-seated resentment, a simmering discontent that only needed a spark to ignite into open rebellion. That spark came from the heavens in the form of a broken climate. Historian Timothy Brooke points to a series of catastrophic environmental crises in the mid-14th century. The Yellow River, China's sorrow, burst its banks in a succession of devastating floods. These weren't just isolated disasters, they were system-wide failures. The floods inundated farmland, destroyed the Grand Canal that was the empire's economic artery, and caused widespread famine. For the peasantry, suffering was immediate and acute. But in the eyes of the people, this suffering carried a deeper meaning. In the traditional Chinese concept of the mandate of heaven, natural disasters were a clear sign that the ruling dynasty had lost the favor of the gods. The Mongol Yuan, already viewed as foreign outsiders, were now seen as illegitimate rulers whose very presence had thrown the natural world into chaos. The belief that heaven had withdrawn its mandate became a self-fulfilling prophecy. From this cauldron of misery emerged the Red Turban Rebellion, a massive peasant uprising fueled by millenarian Buddhist beliefs and a fierce desire to expel the Mongol overlords. The rebellion was not a single army but a wave of coordinated insurgencies that swept across the country, overwhelming local Yuan authorities, the dynasty's response was hampered by its own internal rot. The court had grown increasingly corrupt and faction-ridden, while the once feared Mongol military had become overconfident and overstretched, its tactics ill-suited for suppressing a sprawling guerrilla war fought by their own subjects. From this rebellion rose a charismatic former beggar and Buddhist monk named Zhu Yuanzhang. He proved to be a brilliant military and political leader, skillfully uniting the various rebel factions under his command. Channeling the widespread anger, his forces marched on the Yuan capital. The end was swift. The last Yuan emperor fled north without a major final battle, and Zhu Yuanzhang proclaimed the new Ming dynasty. The Mongol collapse in China demonstrates a critical rule of empire. Ruling a sophisticated and populous society requires more than military dominance. It requires cultural legitimacy. The Yuan failed to build that bridge, and when environmental catastrophe struck, they had no reservoir of public goodwill to draw upon. Their rapid fall stands as a stark lesson in the perils of governing from a distance, both geographically and culturally. This pattern of a society buckling under environmental strain finds one of its most isolated and poignant examples on a remote island in the vast Pacific Ocean. The giant stone faces of Easter Island stare inland, their backs to an empty ocean. This was not always a lonely place. The society we call Rapa Nui once supported a complex civilization capable of quarrying, transporting, and erecting nearly 900 of these monumental moai statues. Yet when European explorers first made contact in the 1700s, they found a society in its death throes, its population a shattered remnant. The collapse was not a single event but a swift, brutal unraveling driven by an ecological catastrophe of their own making. The central theory, championed by geographers like Jared Diamond, is a classic case of ecological overshoot. The Polynesian settlers arrived on an island paradise covered in a vast forest of giant palm trees. These trees were the foundation of life, providing wood for canoes to fish in deep waters, materials for homes, and rollers to transport their famous statues. But the culture became obsessed with the moai. In a competitive spiral, rival clans cut down more and more trees to use as levers and rollers in a race to build ever larger monuments. They did not stop when the forests began to thin. They cut the very last tree. The consequences were immediate and irreversible. Without trees, the soil, exposed to wind and rain, eroded away. Crop yields plummeted. Without large canoes, they could no longer hunt porpoises and deep-sea fish, a vital source of protein. The society that built towering stone giants was suddenly starving on a barren rock. This resource crash shattered the social order. The same clans that once competed in statue building now turned to warfare over the scraps. Archaeological evidence reveals a grim shift, with tools hastily fashioned from obsidian, not for carving but for violence. The culture itself fractured. The moai, symbols of ancestral power and clan prestige, were systematically toppled by rival groups, a deliberate act of cultural destruction. This internal collapse was then catastrophically amplified by the arrival of Europeans, but they did not bring a conquering army. They brought disease and a new kind of predator. Slave raids from Peru in the 1860s kidnapped thousands, including the last remaining chiefs and priests, the living libraries of Rapa Nui knowledge and history. Smallpox and other diseases ravaged those who remained. The population, already weakened by generations of famine and conflict, was pushed over the edge. The story of Rapa Nui is a haunting microcosm of global sustainability. Their isolation was both their making and their undoing, magnifying every mistake with no margin for error. They could not trade for food when their crops failed, and they could not migrate when their island failed them. They were a civilization trapped on a tiny planet of their own creation, a stark lesson in how the relentless consumption of a single, vital resource can cause a society to implode with breathtaking speed. This pattern of a vast, multi-ethnic empire finally shattering under the weight of its own outdated structures finds a powerful echo in the early 20th century with the final, rapid dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. For over 600 years, the Ottoman Empire was a permanent fixture on the world map, a sprawling Islamic caliphate that bridged continents. Yet its end, formalized by the Treaty of Sevres in 1920, was stunningly abrupt, the culmination of pressures that converged in just a few short years. How did the sick man of Europe finally expire so quickly? The empire entered the 20th century already weakened by centuries of internal stagnation and the gradual loss of territory. But its fatal decision to enter the First World War on the losing side acted as a detonator. The war drained its last resources and resulted in catastrophic military defeat. The victorious Allied powers, particularly Britain and France, immediately moved to carve up the Ottoman heartland, occupying Istanbul and planning to partition Anatolia itself. This external imposition of a harsh peace treaty was the ultimate shock, yet the collapse was not purely a result of foreign pressure. A powerful new force had been growing within the empire's borders: Turkish nationalism. Led by a brilliant military commander named Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, this movement rejected the Allied plans entirely. From Ankara, Kemal rallied the remnants of the Ottoman army and a population weary of war and foreign domination. The Turkish War of Independence that followed was not a slow rebellion, but a rapid and decisive military and political campaign that expelled the occupying Greek armies and forced the Allies back to the negotiating table. In a stunning reversal, the Treaty of Sevres was scrapped and replaced by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which recognized the new sovereign Republic of Turkey. The old empire was not just defeated, it was consciously abolished. The last sultan, Mehmed VI, was deposed and sent into exile, and the 600-year-old Ottoman Caliphate was formally ended. The Ottoman collapse was therefore a dual process, an external shattering followed by an internal rebirth. It shows that even the most ancient empires can be dismantled almost overnight when military defeat, foreign intervention, and a potent new national identity align to create an unstoppable force for change. The Ottoman Empire entered the 20th century a ghost of its former self, yet its final disintegration still arrived with shocking speed. The First World War acted as a detonator on a structure already weakened by internal decay. Choosing the losing side proved catastrophic, draining the empire's last resources and ending in the humiliating armistice of 1918. The victorious Allies then moved to systematically dismantle the state, imposing the draconian Treaty of Sevres. This treaty aimed to carve up the Ottoman heartland of Anatolia itself, reducing it to little more than a dependent territory under foreign control. It was the ultimate external shock, a blueprint for dissolution delivered by foreign powers. Yet the empire's internal fabric was already fraying beyond repair. Its greatest vulnerability was its multi-ethnic structure. For centuries, this diversity had been a source of strength, but under the pressure of modern nationalism, it became a critical weakness. Uprisings and independence movements had been chipping away at its Balkan and Arab provinces for decades. By the war's end, the central government in Istanbul had lost the loyalty of vast swaths of its own population, who now dreamed of their own sovereign states. This internal fragmentation created a power vacuum that the Allies were all too ready to fill. But the story does not end with a simple surrender. From the ashes of this collapse, a powerful new force emerged: Turkish nationalism. Its leader, Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, refused to accept the treaty's terms. His words became a rallying cry for a nation facing extinction. He argued that independence was won by determination and sacrifice, not by pleading with outsiders. From the city of Ankara, he organized a defiant resistance, rallying the remnants of the Ottoman army and a populace weary of foreign domination. The resulting Turkish War of Independence was a stunning reversal. It was not a slow rebellion but a rapid, decisive campaign that expelled invading Greek armies and forced the Allies back to the negotiating table. The Treaty of Sevres was scrapped and replaced by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which recognized the sovereign Republic of Turkey. In a final, symbolic act, the 600-year-old Ottoman Sultanate was formally abolished, and the last sultan sent into exile. The empire did not just fade away, it was consciously and swiftly replaced. The Ottoman collapse is a masterclass in how global conflict can accelerate internal fragmentation. It demonstrates that an empire can be dismantled almost overnight when military defeat, economic dependency, and rising nationalist fervor converge. From its ruins, new nations like Turkey, Syria, and Iraq were born, redrawing the map of the Middle East in a breathtakingly short span of years. This pattern of a seemingly stable civilization shattering under a confluence of pressures takes us back to an even more ancient mystery, one where the cause of collapse is still hotly debated by archaeologists. The gleaming citadels of the Mycenaean world suffered a similar fate. The same silence that swallowed the Minone palaces soon echoed in the halls of Mycenae itself. The Mycenaean Greeks, the legendary contemporaries of Troy, ruled from mighty citadels with walls so vast later generations would call them Cyclopean. Yet around 1200 BC, their entire world of warrior kings, scribes, and far-flung trade vanished. The great palaces at Mycenae, Turin, and Pylos were burned and abandoned. The intricate Linear B script, used to record inventories of chariots and olive oil, was forgotten, plunging Greece into a dark age that would last for centuries. What could topple such a powerful and organized society so completely? The evidence points not to a single enemy, but to a cascade of failures that shattered their centralized system. Archaeologists like Oliver Dickinson highlight a critical vulnerability. The Mycenaean economy was a top-heavy, palace-centric operation. Everything from the production of bronze to the distribution of food was controlled by a rigid, bureaucratic administration. When that central authority faltered, the entire economic structure collapsed like a table with its legs kicked out. The triggers for this breakdown were multiple and devastating. Geological evidence suggests a period of intense earthquakes may have physically destroyed key citadels, shaking the very foundations of their power. At the same time, the wider collapse of Bronze Age trade networks, possibly triggered by the mysterious Sea Peoples, severed the Mycenaeans from their sources of tin and copper, the essential ingredients for the bronze that armed their warriors and validated their elite status. This economic strangulation likely fueled intense internal social unrest. A starving population, no longer supplied by the palace, would have turned on their rulers. The professional administrators and scribes, their purpose gone, simply disappeared, taking the knowledge of writing with them. The Mycenaean collapse is a powerful lesson in the danger of over-centralization. Their civilization was so tightly wound around the palace that when the center could not hold, everything unraveled at once. Their fate demonstrates how a regional collapse, when tied into a wider interconnected system, can create a domino effect of failure. This pattern of a seemingly invincible power disintegrating under the strain of its own ambitions finds a dramatic parallel millennia later, when another European empire built on military genius evaporated in a matter of years. Napoleon Bonaparte's French Empire reshaped the continent, its borders stretching from Spain to the gates of Moscow. Yet this colossal domain crumbled with a swiftness that stunned the world. The turning point was the disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. Napoleon marched in with his Grand Armée, one of the largest military forces ever assembled. He expected a quick, decisive victory. Instead, he encountered the Russian winter and a strategy of scorched earth. The Russians retreated, burning their own cities and crops, leaving the French to starve and freeze in the endless snow. Of the nearly 500,000 men who crossed the border, only a shattered remnant of a few tens of thousands staggered back. This catastrophic loss of men and morale was a blow from which the empire never recovered. The aura of Napoleonic invincibility was broken. Seizing the moment, a coalition of rival powers including Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia united against him. The defeat at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, known as the Battle of Nations, forced Napoleon to abdicate and go into exile. Though he would briefly return for a final 100-day campaign, his defeat at Waterloo in 1815 was the definitive end. The empire, built so rapidly on a foundation of military victories, could not survive without them. Its collapse was the direct result of imperial overstretch, the fatal miscalculation that a single nation could dominate an entire continent against the collective will of its people. Napoleon's empire stretched across a continent, yet it proved as fragile as glass. His downfall was not a slow decay but a spectacular implosion, triggered by a single, catastrophic miscalculation. The invasion of Russia in 1812 was meant to be his masterstroke, a final demonstration of French power that would force Tsar Alexander to his knees. Instead, it became a death march. Napoleon's Grand Armée, over 600,000 strong, marched into a vast emptiness. The Russian strategy was simple and brutal. They retreated, burning their own cities and crops, leaving the French to starve. When winter arrived, it finished the job. The retreat from Moscow was one of history's great horrors, with thousands of soldiers freezing to death on the long march home. Of that colossal force, only a ragged fraction ever returned. This was more than a military defeat. It was a shattering of the empire's very soul. The aura of Napoleonic invincibility, carefully cultivated for over a decade, evaporated overnight. As historian David G. Chandler noted, the failure was as much about logistics and morale as it was about battle tactics. The empire was stretched too thin, its supply lines snapping under the immense distance. The French economy, already strained by years of continuous warfare, could not bear the cost of such a catastrophic loss. The defeat created a power vacuum that France's rivals were eager to fill. Seizing the moment, a grand coalition of Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia united with a single purpose: to break Napoleon's grip on Europe. The Battle of Leipzig in 1813, the Battle of Nations, was the final reckoning. Outnumbered and surrounded, Napoleon's forces were crushed. He was forced to abdicate and exiled to the island of Elba. Though his dramatic return for the 100 Days campaign created a final burst of tension, his decisive defeat at Waterloo in 1815 sealed the empire's fate. The victorious powers then gathered at the Congress of Vienna, a diplomatic marathon aimed at erasing the revolutionary and Napoleonic era from the map of Europe. They systematically dismantled French hegemony, redrawing borders to create a balance of power designed to prevent any single nation from dominating the continent again. The Napoleonic collapse is the ultimate lesson in imperial overreach. It demonstrates that rapid expansion, fueled by ambition alone, creates a hollow empire. Such a state has no deep roots, no lasting loyalty from conquered peoples, and no economic resilience. When faced with a unified coalition of enemies and exhausted from within, it can reverse its fortunes with breathtaking speed. This pattern of a dynasty collapsing under the weight of its own flawed leadership finds an ancient and mysterious precedent in the blood-soaked oracle bones of the Shang dynasty. A single battle sealed the fate of China's first historically confirmed dynasty. The Shang had ruled for centuries, their power expressed in magnificent bronze ritual vessels and a society centered on ancestor worship and divination. Yet their downfall at the Battle of Mui in 1046 BC was stunningly swift, a collapse not of weakness but of legitimacy violently withdrawn. Ancient texts like the Bamboo Annals paint a portrait of a terminal king, Zhu, whose name would become synonymous with tyranny. He was said to have drowned in decadence, constructing a lake of wine and a forest of hanging meats for his personal orgies, all while ignoring the suffering of his people. This was more than mere misrule. It was a fundamental breach of the cosmic contract. The Shang kings derived their authority from their unique ability to communicate with the ancestral spirits through oracle bones. When King Zhu's excesses and his perceived failures in divination showed he could no longer reliably intercede with the gods, the people believed he had lost the mandate of heaven. This spiritual vacuum created an opening for a rival power, the Zhou from the west. The Zhou were not militarily superior in a technological sense. Both sides used bronze weapons and chariots. Their true advantage was political and moral. They skillfully built a coalition of disaffected states and tribes, presenting themselves not as conquerors but as liberators. They weaponized the narrative of Shang corruption, portraying King Zhu as a moral monster who had forfeited his right to rule. The Battle of Mui was less a military contest than a judgment. According to tradition, many Shang soldiers, their loyalty eroded by years of oppressive rule, simply refused to fight or turned their weapons against their own king. The transition was so rapid and complete that the Zhou were able to establish their own dynasty almost immediately, justifying their takeover with a philosophy of accountable rulership that would echo through Chinese history for millennia. The Shang collapse demonstrates that the most sophisticated technology and the most entrenched religious power are no defense against a population that has lost all faith in its leaders. A similar loss of control, though on a global scale, would soon grip the first transoceanic empire in history. The Spanish Empire in the Americas assembled a domain of unbelievable wealth with astonishing speed. Yet it too would begin to fracture almost as quickly as it was formed. Silver and gold built an empire, but they could not hold it together. The Spanish Empire in the Americas, a dominion that had taken centuries to assemble, began to fracture with stunning speed in the early 19th century. For 300 years, Spanish galleons had carried the wealth of continents across the ocean, financing European wars and cementing royal authority. Yet, within the span of just 2 decades, from 1810 to 1825, this colossal structure crumbled, and nearly all of its mainland territories won their independence. How did an empire so vast and deeply entrenched vanish from the Americas almost overnight? The trigger was an earthquake in Europe, the Napoleonic invasion of Spain in 1808. When Napoleon Bonaparte placed his own brother on the Spanish throne, he severed the vital chain of loyalty that bound the colonies to the mother country. In the Americas, councils known as juntas argued that with the legitimate king imprisoned, sovereignty reverted to the people. This was not initially a call for independence, but for self-rule in the king's name. Yet the genie of autonomy was out of the bottle. Into this power vacuum flowed the powerful currents of the Enlightenment. Ideas of liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty born in Europe now turned against the colonial powers. The Creoles, the American-born descendants of Spanish settlers, had long chafed under the rule of peninsulares, officials born in Spain who monopolized the highest offices. They were wealthy, educated, and now, inspired by the American and French revolutions, they were ready to lead. Their cause was fueled by deep economic grievances. Spain's mercantilist policies forced the colonies to trade only with the mother country, stifling local economies and entrepreneurship. The Creoles wanted free trade and control over their own destinies. The revolutionary fire was lit, and it found its most brilliant torchbearer in Simón Bolívar. A man of immense education and unwavering determination, Bolívar traveled to Europe and witnessed the rise of Napoleon firsthand. He returned to South America convinced that his homeland must be free. His words became a battle cry for a continent. He once declared that a people that do not secure their liberty are condemned to lose it, and that idleness and negligence are the causes of their destruction. He was not just a military leader, he was a philosopher of revolution, articulating a vision of a united Latin America, free from the chains of colonial oppression. His armies, along with those of other leaders like José de San Martin, achieved a series of lightning victories that stunned the world. The Battle of Boyacá in 1819 secured the independence of New Granada, the heart of modern-day Colombia. The Battle of Carabobo in 1821 liberated Venezuela. The decisive Battle of Ayacucho in Peru in 1824 marked the final major engagement, crushing the last royalist army on the South American mainland. These were not long, drawn-out wars of attrition. They were swift, decisive campaigns that leveraged local knowledge, the fervor of a new cause, and the crippling inability of a besieged Spain to reinforce its armies across the Atlantic. By 1825, the Spanish Empire in the Americas was a ghost, reduced to the islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico. The collapse was a perfect storm of external shock and internal awakening. The Napoleonic Wars provided the opportunity, Enlightenment ideals provided the justification, and economic discontent provided the popular support. The Spanish case demonstrates that an empire's greatest weakness can be a shift in the very ideas that legitimize its rule. When the people stop believing in the right of a distant power to govern them, and when a compelling new vision of freedom takes hold, even the most powerful colonial structures can be swept away in a historical instant. This pattern of a seemingly stable society vanishing from the historical record takes us to an even deeper mystery, one written not in declarations of independence, but in stone tools and mammoth bones across an ancient continent. The silent fate of the Clovis people echoes across millennia. Around 12,000 years ago, these pioneering hunters, famed for their exquisitely crafted fluted spear points, vanished from North America with startling speed. Their distinct tools, found from coast to coast, suddenly disappear from the archaeological record, leaving behind one of prehistory's most enduring puzzles. What could erase a culture so widespread in what seems like a geological instant? The leading theories point to a dramatic and rapid change in their world. A sudden climatic shift called the Younger Dryas event plunged the region back into Ice Age conditions for over 1,000 years. This was not a gradual cooling, but a violent snap freeze that would have transformed lush hunting grounds into barren, inhospitable landscapes almost overnight. For a society utterly dependent on specific game animals and plant resources, this was an existential crisis. The very environment they had mastered turned against them. Competing with this climate theory is the controversial overkill hypothesis. This suggests that the Clovis people were too successful. As they spread across the continent, they encountered giant mammals like mammoths and mastodons that had never seen humans before and had no fear of them. It is possible that these skilled hunters drove dozens of species of megafauna to extinction in a relatively short time. If so, they would have inadvertently destroyed their own primary food source, causing their society to collapse from within. Archaeologist Vance Holliday notes a critical clue: the lack of evidence for widespread violence. There are no mass graves, no fortified settlements, no signs of warfare. This points away from a sudden invasion and toward a more insidious kind of failure, an inability to adapt. When the climate shifted and the great beasts vanished, the Clovis way of life, so specialized and so effective, may have become a trap. They were experts in a world that no longer existed. Their rapid disappearance reminds us that small, mobile societies, while resilient in many ways, can leave very faint footprints. A single generation of hardship, a failed adaptation, is enough to make an entire culture vanish from the record, leaving only their elegant stone points as a monument to their passing. The Clovis case underscores a fundamental truth: that climate is not just a backdrop for history, but a powerful, often ruthless protagonist. This pattern of a sophisticated state buckling under environmental and administrative pressures finds a clear parallel in the ancient world with the swift fall of China's Han Dynasty. Even the Han Dynasty, a golden age of Chinese culture, could not escape history's sudden pivot. For 4 centuries, it provided stability and prosperity, yet its final unraveling was breathtakingly swift. By the year 220, the empire was shattered, splintered among rival warlords. This was not a slow decline, but a rapid implosion fueled by a toxic brew of court corruption, popular fury, and a collapsing social contract. The historian Sima Qian, chronicling an earlier period of Han strife, captured the essence of the decay when he wrote of a government where flatterers were rewarded and the loyal were dismissed. This rot had reached the very heart of the palace. A powerful class of court eunuchs, initially servants, had maneuvered themselves into controlling the emperor and manipulating state affairs, creating a shadow government that was both greedy and deeply unpopular with the scholarly elite and regional governors. This political corruption was magnified by a profound economic crisis. Wealth and land became concentrated in the hands of a few great families, while the peasant majority sank into debt and serfdom. The tax burden on small farmers became unbearable, forcing many off their land and creating a vast, discontented underclass. Then came the environmental triggers. A series of natural disasters, including catastrophic floods along the Yellow River and widespread famines, were interpreted by the suffering masses as a clear sign that the Han had lost the mandate of heaven. From this tinderbox of misery erupted the Yellow Turban Rebellion in the year 184. Led by faith healers promising a new cosmic era, hundreds of thousands of peasants, identifiable by their yellow headscarves, rose up in a coordinated, explosive uprising. Though the rebellion was eventually suppressed by Han forces with the help of regional warlords, the damage was irreversible. The central government, having proven its weakness, could no longer control the very generals who had saved it. These warlords turned their armies against the throne, fighting each other for supremacy in a bloody free-for-all. The emperor became a puppet, and the once unified empire fractured into 3 warring kingdoms. The Han collapse is a masterclass in how internal decay invites terminal chaos. It demonstrates that a state can be brought down not by a foreign army, but by its own failure to maintain justice and economic balance. The very bureaucracy that held the empire together for centuries became a vehicle for its own destruction when corruption replaced competence. This pattern of a venerable empire finally succumbing to a single, decisive blow finds its ultimate expression in the fate of its eastern successor, the Byzantine Empire. The end of the Byzantine Empire arrived with the roar of a new kind of thunder. For nearly 1,000 years after Rome fell in the west, Constantinople had stood as a bastion of civilization, its massive walls repelling countless armies. Yet its final collapse in 1453 was stunningly swift, a matter of weeks rather than centuries. The empire had been shrinking for a long time, reduced to little more than its magnificent capital city and a few scattered outposts. Its wealth was gone, its population a shadow of its former self, and its political and religious authority fractured by centuries of conflict, most damagingly with Western crusaders who had sacked their own Christian ally 200 years earlier. The empire was a venerable old tree, hollowed out from within, waiting for a strong wind to topple it. That wind was the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, and he brought a storm of unprecedented force. His secret weapon was a massive cannon designed by a Hungarian engineer, so large it had to be transported by dozens of oxen. This technological marvel could hurl a stone ball weighing over half a ton against the ancient Theodosian walls, which had stood impregnable for a millennium. For weeks, these walls, the empire's ultimate defense, were systematically pounded into rubble. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos fought desperately with a tiny force of perhaps 7,000 men against an Ottoman army exceeding 50,000. The historian Kritavoulos recorded the final, brutal assault. After nearly 2 months of siege, the Ottomans launched an all-out attack before dawn on May 29th. For hours, the defenders held the breaches, but a pivotal moment came when a small postern gate, the Kirkaporta, was left open. Ottoman soldiers poured through, creating a fatal breach in the defense. The emperor, casting off his imperial regalia so as not to be identified, plunged into the fray and was never seen again, dying in the chaos of his capital's fall. The city was subjected to 3 days of pillage, and the great church of Hagia Sophia, the spiritual heart of Eastern Christianity, was converted into a mosque. The fall of Constantinople was more than a military defeat. It was an event that erased a political entity that had endured since the time of Augustus. It demonstrated that even the most legendary defenses are useless against a technological leap, and that an empire surviving on past glory and hollowed by internal division can be ended by a single decisive siege. This pattern of a seemingly permanent empire dissolving with breathtaking speed finds a parallel in the fate of another pioneering sea power, the Portuguese Empire. A global empire can dissolve in the space of a single generation. The Portuguese Empire, the first and longest-lasting of the European colonial powers, saw its vast holdings vanish with breathtaking speed in the 1970s. For centuries, it had maintained a scattered but tenacious grip on territories from Brazil to Angola, from Mozambique to Macau. Its endurance seemed remarkable, having outlasted the Spanish, Dutch, and French empires in many parts of the world. Yet this ancient structure, which had weathered the rise and fall of so many others, finally collapsed in a matter of months. The trigger was not a world war, but a domestic revolution. On April 25, 1974, a bloodless military coup in Lisbon, known as the Carnation Revolution, toppled the authoritarian Estado Novo regime. The soldiers who led the uprising placed carnations in the barrels of their rifles, a symbol of their peaceful intentions. Their primary motivation was to end Portugal's draining and unpopular colonial wars in Africa. For over a decade, the Portuguese army had been fighting nationalist insurgencies in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique. These conflicts were a massive drain on a relatively poor European nation, costing it blood and treasure with no victory in sight. Historian C.R. Boxer had long argued that the empire was a classic case of imperial overstretch. Portugal, a small country with limited resources, was trying to hold onto an empire far too large for it to manage or afford, especially in the face of rising competition and a changing global order. The new revolutionary government in Lisbon understood this immediately. They moved with stunning swiftness to dismantle the very structure the old regime had fought to preserve. Within a year of the coup, Portugal granted independence to its major African colonies. The transition was remarkably peaceful from the Portuguese perspective, a simple withdrawal rather than a negotiated settlement. The empire, which had taken 500 years to build, was largely dismantled in under 2 years. This rapid dissolution was fueled by forces that had been building for decades. A powerful wave of anti-colonial sentiment had swept across Africa and Asia after the Second World War. The Portuguese colonies were not immune. Nationalist movements, inspired by leaders like Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau, had successfully organized and mobilized populations, making the cost of continued occupation unbearable for Lisbon. The Portuguese case is a masterclass in the power of modern decolonization. It demonstrates that in the 20th century, an empire could be brought down not by a rival superpower, but by the determined resistance of its subjects and the eventual withdrawal of will from its own people and soldiers. The costs of suppressing the human desire for freedom simply became too high. This pattern of a sophisticated society reaching a breaking point and then rapidly abandoning its heartland finds one of its most enigmatic examples not in an empire of steel and gunpowder, but in the silent stone pueblos of the American Southwest. The silent stone cities of the American Southwest hold a different kind of mystery. The ancestral pueblones, once known as the Anasazi, did not vanish from the earth. They simply walked away from their magnificent cliffside apartments at places like Mesa Verde and Choco Canyon around 1300 CE, leaving their homes perfectly intact, as if expecting to return any day. They never did. This was not an invasion or a single catastrophic event, but a swift and decisive abandonment driven by a slow-moving environmental crisis. Tree ring data, the precise diary of the region's climate, tells a stark story of a great drought that gripped the Southwest for decades. The rings from that period are desperately narrow, revealing years upon years of failed rains. For a people living on the edge of a high desert dependent on maize agriculture, this was an unending disaster. Their carefully managed fields dried up, and their reservoirs carved into the rock held only dust. But the drought alone does not explain the violence left behind. Archaeologists like Stephen H. Lexon point to a grim archaeological record that emerged as resources vanished. At some sites, there is evidence of burned structures and even cannibalism, suggesting that social bonds frayed to a breaking point under the strain of hunger. The competition for the last reliable springs and the final productive fields turned neighbor against neighbor. The society did not so much collapse as it explosively dispersed. The people did not die out, they migrated. They moved south and east, joining other communities and eventually forming the modern Pueblo villages along the Rio Grande. Their magnificent stone cities were not tombs, but way stations abandoned in a grand, strategic retreat. The story of the ancestral pueblones is a powerful lesson in resilience. It shows that a society can vanish from one place almost overnight, not through extinction, but through a profound cultural adaptation. They chose to transform their entire way of life to survive, trading their towering cliff dwellings for a more sustainable future. This pattern of a global empire voluntarily dismantling itself in the face of new realities would be repeated on a world historic scale just a few generations ago. The sun never set on the British Empire until it did with remarkable speed. In the 2 decades following the Second World War, this colossal global network, the largest empire in history, underwent a rapid and largely peaceful dissolution. How could a power that had dominated a quarter of the world's landmass willingly relinquish its control so quickly? the war itself had left Britain financially exhausted and morally depleted. The immense cost of the conflict drained the national treasury, making the expense of administering a vast overseas empire unsustainable. At the same time, the ideological fight against fascism had championed the cause of freedom and self-determination, principles that now turned against the colonial powers themselves. A new superpower dynamic emerged, with both the United States and the Soviet Union opposing old-fashioned colonialism. But the most irresistible force was the surge of nationalist movements within the colonies themselves. In India, the moral and political leadership of figures like Mahatma Gandhi mobilized millions in a sustained campaign for independence. The sheer logistical and ethical cost of maintaining control over a subcontinent demanding its freedom became too great for a war-weary Britain to bear. India and Pakistan gained independence in 1947, setting a powerful precedent. This was the domino that began the cascade. Across Africa and Asia, from Ghana to Malaya, the same story played out. The British government, recognizing the inevitable and often preferring a managed transition to a bloody conflict, began a process of negotiated withdrawal. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was the final, humiliating confirmation that Britain's time as a global superpower was over. Its failed attempt to seize the canal in collusion with France and Israel, against the will of both the United States and the United Nations, proved it could no longer act unilaterally. The empire did not fall to a conquering army. It was dismantled from within and without, its legitimacy evaporating in the face of a new world order. The Union Jack was lowered in dozens of territories, not in defeat, but in a pragmatic acknowledgement that the age of empire had passed. The British collapse demonstrates that even the most powerful political structures are subject to the tides of economic reality and the unyielding human desire for self-rule. The sun finally set on the British Empire with a swiftness that belied its centuries of global dominance. Emerging from the Second World War victorious but financially ruined, Britain found the economic burden of maintaining its empire utterly unsustainable. The nation was saddled with immense war debt, its industries were exhausted, and the cost of administering distant colonies became a luxury it could no longer afford. This fiscal reality collided with an unstoppable moral and political force, the rise of powerful nationalist movements across its territories. In India, the philosophy of non-violent resistance championed by Mahatma Gandhi mobilized millions, making colonial rule a logistical and ethical nightmare for the British administration. The sheer will of the Indian people for self-rule, expressed through mass protests and civil disobedience, demonstrated that empires cannot govern without at least the acquiescence of the governed. By 1947, Britain had no choice but to grant independence, a move that sent a shockwave through every other colony. The old guard of the empire fought this tide with bitter reluctance. Winston Churchill, who had once vowed he had not become the king's first minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire, gave voice to this imperial sorrow. Yet his words were a rear-guard action against an inevitable historical current. The final, humiliating confirmation of this new reality came with the Suez Crisis of 1956. In a secret pact with France and Israel, Britain attempted to seize control of the Suez Canal from Egypt. The venture was a catastrophic failure, opposed not only by the international community but decisively by the United States. Washington forced a British withdrawal, proving that London could no longer act as an independent global power. This was the empire's ultimate geopolitical rupture. The message was clear: the age of colonial empires was over. What followed was not a slow decline, but a controlled yet rapid dismantling. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Britain negotiated the independence of dozens of territories from Ghana to Malaya in a process of managed retreat. The empire did not fall to a conquering army. It was voluntarily dissolved, its authority evaporating in the face of economic necessity and the universal cry for freedom. Its transformation into the voluntary association of the Commonwealth was a graceful acknowledgement of this new reality, a ghost of an empire that chose to vanish rather than be destroyed. This peaceful but rapid dissolution stands as a powerful testament to how geopolitical shifts and moral pressures can dismantle even the most colossal structures. It forces us to look for similar patterns of sudden transformation in much older, more mysterious collapses, like the enigmatic fall of the Tiwanaku Empire high in the Andes. The stone monoliths of Tiwanaku stand as silent sentinels to a forgotten power. High on the Bolivian Altiplano, this pre-Inca empire built a capital city that rivaled any in the ancient world, with a population that may have exceeded 100,000 people. Its engineers mastered a harsh environment, creating a vast agricultural system of raised fields and canals that turned the marshy shores of Lake Titicaca into a fertile breadbasket. Yet by the year 1000, this thriving metropolis was being systematically abandoned. The collapse was not gradual, it was a swift and decisive unraveling. The empire's greatest strength became its ultimate vulnerability. Those ingenious raised fields were a masterpiece of hydrological engineering, but they depended entirely on a predictable climate and a stable water level in the lake. When that foundation shifted, the entire civilization was left perilously exposed. Core samples drilled from the lakebed tell a stark story. The sediment layers reveal a prolonged and catastrophic drought that gripped the region for decades. The water levels in Lake Titicaca dropped dramatically, leaving the intricate canal network dry and the raised fields barren. The empire's agricultural surplus, the very source of its wealth and central authority, evaporated under the relentless sun. Archaeologist Alan Carlotta describes this as a fatal convergence. The environmental disaster triggered a political and social crisis. As famine spread, the authority of the priestly elite in the capital crumbled. They could no longer command the labor needed to maintain the agricultural system, and they had lost their divine mandate to bring rain and fertility. This internal fragmentation made the empire a target. Without a strong central army, Tiwanaku was vulnerable to invasions by rival groups from the surrounding hills. The evidence suggests the capital was not destroyed in a great battle, but simply emptied. People dispersed into smaller, more resilient communities in lower valleys, adapting to a new, drier reality. The grand stone temples and palaces were left to the wind, a haunting monument to a society that mastered its environment, only to be mastered by it. The Tiwanaku collapse underscores a profound truth, that even the most brilliant human organization is tethered to the health of the natural world it depends upon. This pattern of a vast, centralized empire shattering under a sudden, overwhelming force finds its ultimate expression in the fate of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. It was the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, a colossal domain stretching from the Indus River to the Balkans, unified under a single administration. Yet this Leviathan was brought to its knees in the span of just a few years. The architect of its rapid downfall was a young king from the mountainous periphery of Greece, Alexander of Macedon. His invasion was less a war of attrition and more a surgical strike at the empire's political heart. The Persian military, though vast, was a multi-ethnic patchwork often led by rival satraps or governors whose loyalty to the distant king was not always absolute. Alexander exploited these internal divisions with brilliant strategy. His victory at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC was the decisive blow. He did not need to conquer every province, he simply had to defeat the king. When Darius III fled the battlefield and was later murdered by his own nobles, the entire Persian governmental structure lost its head. Alexander, in a masterstroke of political theater, proclaimed himself the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid throne. He adopted Persian dress and customs and appointed former Persian officials to key posts. This was not a wholesale destruction, but a hostile takeover of a pre-existing administrative machine. The empire did not slowly crumble. Its central command was captured and repurposed in one of history's most stunning and rapid transfers of power. The Persian collapse demonstrates that size alone is no guarantee of stability. A vast, diverse empire can be felled with breathtaking speed when a determined adversary targets its central leadership and exploits its internal weaknesses, proving that the most imposing giant can be toppled by a single, well-aimed thrust. Cyrus the Great forged an empire of unprecedented scale, yet its disintegration was almost as swift as its rise. The Achaemenid Persian Empire stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea, a mosaic of cultures and satrapies held together by a sophisticated network of roads and administrators. Its sheer size was its greatest asset and its most profound weakness. When Alexander of Macedon crossed into Anatolia in 334 BCE, he was not confronting a monolithic state, but a loosely connected realm where provincial governors often prized their own power above loyalty to the distant King of Kings. Alexander understood this fragility perfectly. His army was not larger, but it was a perfectly coordinated instrument of shock and maneuver. His core innovation was the sarissa, a pike nearly 18 feet long, wielded by his phalanx in a bristling wall of iron that no Persian infantry could penetrate. This solid anvil allowed his companion cavalry, the elite horsemen of Macedonia, to act as a devastating hammer, striking at the precise moment to shatter the enemy's command structure. The ancient historian Arrian captures the pandemonium of the final, decisive clash at Gaugamela. He describes the dust cloud so thick it obscured the battlefield, the terrifying charge of Persian scythed chariots that the Macedonians simply parted to let pass, and the moment Alexander himself led his cavalry in a headlong charge directly at King Darius. The Persian center collapsed not from sheer casualties but from the flight of its commander. Darius turned his chariot and fled, and with him vanished the will of his entire army. The administrative machinery of the empire, so dependent on the person of the king, instantly seized up. Satraps surrendered their provinces, and cities opened their gates, not to a destroyer, but to a new self-proclaimed master who presented himself as the legitimate heir to the Achaemenid throne. Alexander wore Persian robes, honored local customs, and kept Persian officials in their posts. He did not dismantle the empire so much as he captured its headquarters and assumed control. This rapid transition from Persian to Hellenistic rule reveals a brutal truth about vast, diverse empires. Their centralized authority can be a single point of failure. A single charismatic leader with a focused force, exploiting internal divisions and delivering a decisive psychological blow, can topple a giant in a handful of battles. The world shifted from Persian to Greek hegemony in a breathtakingly short campaign, proving that no empire, no matter how magnificent, is immune to a well-aimed thrust at its heart. This pattern of a sophisticated society vanishing not by conquest but by simply fading away takes us to a much older and quieter mystery, the silent exodus of the Cucuteni Tripilia culture. The fires that consumed the Cucuteni Tripilia settlements burned with a strange regularity. Across Eastern Europe, the largest settlements of their time, some housing thousands of people, were deliberately set ablaze and abandoned around 3000 BCE. This was not the chaos of a single invasion, but a pattern repeated over centuries. Why would a sophisticated Neolithic culture, renowned for its exquisite painted pottery and massive planned villages, systematically burn its own world to the ground? Archaeologist John Chapman proposes a startling theory that this was not a collapse in the traditional sense, but a ritual act of closure. The burning may have been a way to purify a site, to release the spirit of a place before the community moved on. It was a cyclical rebirth, a controlled ending woven into their very understanding of existence. Yet other forces were likely at work, pressing upon this ancient society. A shifting climate may have made their intensive farming less reliable, while the very size of their settlements could have led to local resource depletion, with forests cleared for building and firewood and soils exhausted from continuous cultivation. Then from the vast steppes to the east came a new pressure. Nomadic pastoralists, the Yamnaya people, began to migrate into the region. These mobile warriors with their wheeled carts and domesticated horses represented a completely different way of life, one that may have overwhelmed the settled, agricultural Cucuteni Tripillions. The end was likely a convergence of these pressures. Environmental stress and resource scarcity may have weakened the society, making the old, large settlements unsustainable. The arrival of new peoples could have been the final catalyst that accelerated a process already underway. The ritual burning, whether for spiritual or defensive reasons, became the method of a swift and decisive dispersal. The people did not vanish, they fragmented. They likely broke into smaller, more mobile groups and were gradually absorbed by the incoming populations, their unique cultural identity dissolving over generations. The Cucuteni Tripillia case is a profound lesson from prehistory. It shows that a society does not need written records to experience a rapid, transformative collapse. The fragility of these early complex communities lay in their deep connection to the land and their specific social structures. When those foundations were shaken by climate, competition, or internal ritual, their entire world could be voluntarily abandoned, leaving behind only patterns in the ash and the silent, painted fragments of their pottery. If a society can choose to dismantle itself through ritual, what does that say about the nature of collapse itself? This question of internal choice and external pressure finds a dramatic counterpoint in the fate of history's largest contiguous land empire, which shattered with a speed that mirrored its explosive rise. The Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna, a domain of unimaginable size forged by the will of Genghis Khan. Yet this colossus began to fracture into rival khanates within a single generation of his death. The sheer speed of its fragmentation reveals a critical weakness in empires built solely on conquest. The Mongol military machine was unparalleled, a swift-moving force of horse archers that could strike with devastating precision. But this very strength contained the seeds of its own dissolution. The empire was held together not by a shared culture or a complex bureaucracy, but by the personal authority of the great Khan and the promise of plunder. When that central figure was gone, the vast territory became unmanageable. The successors of Genghis Khan, his sons and grandsons, quickly fell into bitter rivalries over the spoils of their domain. The empire was not an integrated state, but a collection of conquered lands divided among family members. These khanates in Russia, Persia, and Central Asia soon developed their own local interests and power bases. The Golden Horde had little reason to obey the distant Great Khan in China. Without a strong, unifying leader, the personal loyalties that bound the empire together rapidly evaporated. Furthermore, the Mongols were a tiny minority ruling over a vast mosaic of settled civilizations. They lacked the administrative depth to govern such diverse populations in the long term. They often relied on local officials to collect taxes and maintain order, which gradually led to their absorption into the cultures they had conquered. In Persia, the Ilkhanate converted to Islam, while the Yuan dynasty in China adopted many Chinese customs. the empire did not so much collapse as it culturally dissolved from within, its political unity splintering along the very fault lines it had once straddled. The Mongol Empire's rapid fragmentation demonstrates that military might alone cannot sustain an empire. Without a unifying ideology, a shared identity, or a robust administrative system, even the most terrifying conquests can disintegrate into a collection of squabbling states almost as quickly as they were assembled. The death of Genghis Khan in 1227 did not just mark the passing of a ruler, it severed the single thread holding a continent-spanning empire together. His personal charisma and military genius had forged a domain of unprecedented scale, but he left behind no clear mechanism for its peaceful continuation. The result was a rapid unraveling, a fragmentation so swift it demonstrated that an empire built on conquest alone is a fragile construct. Historian Jack Weatherford notes that the Mongols were masters of the battlefield, yet they struggled to master the art of governance across such immense diversity. The sheer speed of their expansion became their greatest liability, as they lacked the administrative depth to manage the countless cultures and territories they now controlled. The empire almost immediately began to splinter into rival khanates, each ruled by a different branch of the royal family. The Golden Horde established its rule over the Russian steppes, while the Ilkhanate took control of Persia. These were not provinces reporting to a central authority, but independent and often competing states. The unity imposed by Genghis Khan's will evaporated into a series of brutal civil wars as his sons and grandsons fought for supremacy. These internal conflicts, known as the Toluid Civil War, drained the empire's resources and shattered any illusion of a unified Mongol state. The central control from the capital at Karakoram became a fiction, its authority ignored by Khans who now pursued their own local ambitions. This fragmentation was accelerated by a powerful, almost inevitable force: cultural assimilation. The Mongol rulers were a tiny minority in the vast, civilized lands they had conquered. In China, Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty adopted Chinese bureaucratic practices. In Persia, the Ilkhanate converted to Islam. Each Khanate gradually absorbed the language, religion, and customs of its subjects, further eroding the shared nomadic identity that had once united them. The empire did not collapse from an external invasion. It dissolved from within, its political structure unable to survive the loss of its founding leader and the centrifugal pull of its own immense size and diversity. The Mongol experience stands as a stark lesson in the critical importance of succession planning. It reveals that an empire's true strength is not measured by the land it conquers, but by the systems it builds to endure beyond the lifetime of a single, extraordinary individual. This pattern of a powerful African state meeting a sudden and decisive end brings us to the mysterious fall of the Kingdom of Kush. The pyramids of Kush still stand in the sands of Sudan, a silent echo of a kingdom that once rivaled its Egyptian neighbors to the north. For centuries, the Kingdom of Kush was a powerhouse, controlling the lucrative trade in gold, ivory, and ebony along the Nile. Its rulers even conquered Egypt itself, establishing the 25th dynasty. Yet by the middle of the 4th century, this formidable empire had vanished from the historical stage. Its collapse was not a slow fade, but a swift unraveling driven by a changing climate and a single, decisive invasion. Geological core samples from the region tell a clear and brutal story. A prolonged period of desertification set in, turning once fertile lands along the Nile into dust. The annual floods that nourished their fields became unreliable, and the agricultural surplus that fed the cities and funded the army began to disappear. This environmental stress triggered a cascade of failures. As crops failed, the population faced famine, weakening the kingdom from within. At the same time, their vital trade routes began to dry up, both literally and economically. The Roman Empire, a major trading partner, was itself in crisis, and the desert caravans that carried Kushite wealth became more difficult to sustain. The kingdom's economy, built on this intricate network of commerce and agriculture, went into a steep decline. Into this moment of profound vulnerability stepped a new power from the east, the Aksumite Empire. Based in the highlands of modern-day Ethiopia, Aksum was a rising naval and commercial force. Around 350 CE, Aksumite armies, equipped with iron weapons and likely employing war elephants, marched on the Kushite heartland. The already weakened Kushite military could not withstand the assault. A famous inscription by the Aksumite king Azona boasts of his victory, detailing the destruction of towns and the taking of captives. Archaeologist David N. Edwards describes how the evidence points to a rapid abandonment of urban centers. The capital of Mara was left to the encroaching desert, its royal palaces and iron-producing industries falling silent. The people did not necessarily vanish, but they dispersed, likely reverting to a more rural, pastoral way of life as the centralized state that had organized their society for a millennium ceased to exist. The fall of Kush is a powerful lesson in the fragility of river-based empires. It shows that even the most strategically located and resource-rich civilization is tethered to the health of its environment. When the climate turned against them and their economic model failed, they became instantly vulnerable to a rival who recognized their moment of weakness. Their legacy is a haunting one, a field of pyramids in the desert reminding us that trade routes can shift and rivers can fail, leaving even the mightiest kingdoms to be reclaimed by the sand. This pattern of a commercial empire rising and falling with stunning speed finds a clear parallel in the story of the Dutch Empire. A global empire can be dismantled by a single trade route. The Dutch Empire, once the world's dominant commercial power, saw its vast network of ships and colonies unravel with breathtaking speed. This was not a collapse of palaces or a conquest by a foreign army, but a quiet, relentless economic strangulation. The Dutch Golden Age had been built on a foundation of unparalleled maritime innovation and financial savvy, with the Dutch East India Company acting as a state within a state, wielding power across the globe. Yet by the 18th century, this economic titan was being systematically outmaneuvered. A series of devastating naval wars with England, a rising power with its own global ambitions, bled the Dutch treasury dry. The Treaty of Westminster in 1674 forced crucial concessions, chipping away at Dutch maritime supremacy. Each conflict was more costly than the last, forcing the Dutch to pour their wealth into building and rebuilding warships instead of trade vessels. The enemy was not just on the seas, but in the ledgers. British mercantilist policies, like the Navigation Acts, deliberately excluded Dutch merchants from lucrative trades, creating a protective economic wall around Britain's own growing empire. The Dutch, with their smaller population and limited natural resources, simply could not keep pace in this new era of state-backed commercial warfare. Their greatest assets, the spice-rich islands of Indonesia, became a financial burden as much as a prize, requiring expensive military garrisons to defend against both local resistance and European rivals. The transition was not marked by a dramatic final battle, but by a slow, peaceful slide into the status of a minor power. The Dutch Empire did not shatter, it simply receded, its commercial dominance quietly absorbed by the British behemoth. This rapid commercial decline underscores a brutal truth that empires built on trade can vanish when a more efficient, better-funded competitor emerges. How does an entire civilization simply disappear from the archaeological record, leaving behind only haunting portraits of its gods? the Moch people of ancient Peru present one of the America's most compelling mysteries. Their gods were depicted in brilliant gold, yet their civilization was washed away by water. The Moch of northern Peru created one of the most sophisticated societies in the ancient Americas, mastering the arid coastal plains with intricate irrigation canals that fed vast fields of maize and cotton. Their rulers, the lords of Sipon, were buried in tombs overflowing with priceless treasures, and their artisans produced pottery so expressive it seems to capture a living face. Then, around 800 CE, this vibrant culture entered a terminal spiral. The collapse was not gradual, it was a series of brutal shocks that shattered their world within a few generations. Archaeologists excavating sites like the Huaca del Sol, a colossal adobe pyramid, find a story written not in conquest but in mud. The evidence points to a catastrophic climatic onslaught, a cycle of extreme El Niño events. These were not the modern, periodic disruptions we know today, but supercharged versions that brought torrential rains to the desert. Canals designed for careful water distribution were obliterated by flash floods. Adobe brick structures, including entire sections of the Great Huaca, literally melted back into the earth. The farmlands that fed the cities were buried under layers of sterile sand and gravel, rendered useless for a generation. After the deluge came the opposite extreme, a prolonged and severe drought. The systems that had just been destroyed by water now stood empty and dry. The double catastrophe of flood and drought created an inescapable trap. How could a society so adept at managing water fail so completely? Researcher Izumi Shimada describes this as a systems collapse. The Moch economy and political structure were entirely dependent on agricultural surplus. When that surplus vanished for years on end, the authority of the priest kings, who were believed to control the forces of nature, evaporated. The people lost faith. What use was a god king who could not bring rain or stop the floods? This spiritual crisis triggered violent social unrest. At some Moch sites, there is evidence of iconoclasm, the deliberate defacing of religious symbols. Elite residences were burned, and the centralized power that built the Great Pyramids simply disintegrated. The Moch did not vanish, but their political unity did. They fractured into smaller, competing chiefdoms, fighting over the few remaining fertile valleys. The grand artistic traditions ceased, and the cultural fluorescence that defined their golden age was extinguished. The Moch collapse is a stark lesson in the limits of engineering. They had built a civilization perfectly adapted to their normal environment, but they had no resilience against a climate shock that pushed beyond all historical experience. Their story forces us to ask, how would our own sophisticated systems fare against a force of nature for which they were never designed? This pattern of a powerful European empire fragmenting with similar speed, not from climate, but from the simple problem of succession, brings us to the Carolingian world. Charlemagne's colossal empire barely outlived its founder. He forged a realm that stretched across Western Europe, crowned Emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day in the year 800. Yet, just 30 years after his death, his grandsons were carving up his legacy like a pie. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 did not merely redraw borders, it permanently fractured a unified vision of Christendom into 3 separate kingdoms that would one day become France, Germany, and Italy. How could an empire so grand disintegrate with such breathtaking speed? The answer lies in a fatal flaw at its very heart, a lack of any durable system for succession. Charlemagne ruled through the sheer force of his own personality and military prowess, but he failed to establish a clear, centralized bureaucracy that could outlast him. His son and successor, Louis the Pious, was a devout man, but he lacked his father's iron will. The empire's cohesion depended entirely on the strength of the man on the throne, and when that strength faltered, the entire structure began to shudder. Chroniclers like Einhard, Charlemagne's biographer, hinted at these troubles even during the emperor's lifetime, noting the difficulty of controlling such a vast territory and the ambitions of its powerful regional nobles. These nobles or counts held immense local power, and their loyalty was to the king personally, not to the abstract idea of an empire. When the central authority weakened, their regional loyalties surged to the forefront. They began to act as independent princes, further eroding the power of the crown and making the empire ungovernable. This internal rot was then violently accelerated by external shocks. From the north came the Vikings, whose swift longship raids terrorized the unprotected coastlines and river systems of the empire. They sacked monasteries and towns with impunity, striking deep into the heartland. The Carolingian state, already distracted by internal squabbles, proved utterly incapable of mounting a coordinated defense. These raids were more than just attacks. They were a constant drain on resources and a devastating blow to the prestige of a royal house that could no longer protect its people. The final blow was familial. Louis the Piaus's own sons turned against him and then against each other in a series of brutal civil wars, fighting over their inheritance long before their father was even in his grave. This was not a simple dispute. It was a protracted war of all against all that exhausted the empire's treasury and military strength. The Treaty of Verdun was simply the formal recognition of a fragmentation that had already happened. It was a divorce settlement between rival brothers, not a strategic division. The empire was not conquered from the outside, it shattered from within, broken by the competing ambitions of its own ruling family. The Carolingian collapse is a masterclass in the fragility of personal unions. It demonstrates that an empire built around a single great leader is an empire built on sand. Without strong institutions, a clear succession plan, and a shared identity that transcends local ties, even the most powerful state can be pulled apart by the centrifugal forces of regionalism and family strife in just a single generation. From the ashes of this rapid disintegration, the map of modern Europe began to take shape. These sudden collapses, from the Akkadians to the Carolingians, share a common thread. They were not slow declines but rapid unravelings, where multiple pressures converged to break a system at its weakest point. Whether it was a changing climate that destroyed an agricultural base, a new technology that shattered old defenses, or a simple failure of leadership and succession, the result was the same: a breathtakingly swift transformation of the world. These historical ruptures force us to look at our own interconnected world and ask which threads, if pulled, could cause our own complex systems to fray. The greatest threat may not be a single enemy at the gate, but the silent, accumulating stress on the foundations we take for granted. History's most sudden collapses share a haunting rhythm, a recurring pattern where the threads of environment, politics, and economy snap in unison. From the Akkadian dust storms to the Soviet ideological evaporation, we see a consistent warning: the most sophisticated systems are often the most brittle. An empire's true weakness is rarely a single external enemy, but its own lack of resilience, its inability to adapt when the world it was built for suddenly changes. The critical lesson is not that collapse is inevitable, but that it is a choice, a failure to diversify food sources, to maintain flexible institutions, or to listen to the discontent of its own people. Today, our global civilization faces its own convergence of pressures. Climate shifts strain agricultural systems, economic inequalities fuel social friction, and our deeply interconnected world can transmit a crisis from one continent to another in hours. The past does not offer a blueprint, but it provides a sobering checklist. Are our systems over-centralized? Are we too dependent on a single resource or a fragile supply chain? Have we, like the Greenland Norse, become so committed to an outdated way of life that we ignore more sustainable paths? The philosopher George Santayana's words echo across the centuries. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. These stories of vanished empires are not just tales of ancient dust, they are urgent conversations about our own future. What do you believe is the single greatest threat to our modern world's stability? And what lessons from history resonate most with you? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if these mysteries of the past have sparked your curiosity, subscribe for more deep dives into the forces that shape our world. Together, let's keep uncovering the secrets that can guide us toward building a more resilient